I'm going to stay on the basis of chemical evolution.
Well, why is it that people believe in evolution? Well, this man, Ernst Haeckel, was significantly responsible for evolution becoming accepted in Europe. He was an evangelical promoter of Darwinism and was, in fact, the first person to introduce Darwinism into Germany. And if you know, and this is, the mid to late 1800s, and if you understand what Germany was to the world at this time, they were the technological and scientific leader of the world. And once Germany was convinced that Darwinism was true, well, Europe did as well. Ian Taylor states this in the Minds of Men. He, Ernst Haeckel, became Darwin's chief European apostle, proclaiming the gospel of evolution with evangelistic fervor, not only to the university intelligentsia, but to the common man by popular books, and to the working classes by lectures in rented halls. In 1908, Ernst Haeckel received the prestigious Darwin Wallace Medal from the Linnean Society of London. During the awards ceremony, the president of the society read the following commendation of Ernst Haeckel. Professor Haeckel, a personal friend of Mr. Darwin, who paid more than one visit to him at Down, where Darwin lived, has been the great apostle of the Darwin-Wallace theory in Germany. As his advocacy of the doctrine of evolution in his monograph on radiolaria in 1862 first brought it before the attention of German men of science. His enthusiastic and gallant advocacy ever since has chiefly contributed to its success in that country. Mr. Darwin, in 1873, wrote to Professor Haeckel, "You will do a wonderful amount of good in spreading the doctrine of evolution, supporting it as you do by so many original observations." And again, even Darwin himself said that Ernst Haeckel was largely responsible for his theory being accepted in Germany. Well, how did he support Darwin? How did he support Darwin's theory? Let's take a look at some of how Haeckel accomplished this, how he accomplished being able to receive such adoration by the scientific community. Well, embryology, the study of embryos, is used to support evolution by arguing that organisms who share similarities during embryonic development are more closely related in ancestry. This concept represents Ernst Haeckel's most infamous, but not his only, act of fraud committed to convince people that evolution is true. To promote his hypothesis, specifically that humans have evolved from animals, he falsified these drawings. The drawings in this figure to make it look like human embryos were initially identical to those of other animals. He also inserted with the famous phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that embryos go through a series of their former evolutionary stages, where at first we'll have like gills like a fish, then a tail, and well, this hypothesis, sadly, is still upheld by many evolutionists today as what they call the law of recapitulation, that the evolutionary history of an organism is recapped during its embryological development. Well, the continued support for Haeckel's theories amongst evolutionists is most troubling given that the act of fraud was brought to light by one of Haeckel's contemporaries. In 1874, Dr. Wilhelm Hess, shown here, a Swiss anatomist, published an analysis showing that Haeckel had added 3.5 millimeters to the head of the dog, taken 2.2 millimeters off the head of the human embryo, doubled the length of the human posterior, and substantially altered the details of the human eye. His sarcastically pointed out that Haeckel taught at Jena University, which was home to some of the finest optical equipment available to the day and thus had no excuses for such inaccuracies. His concluded that anyone who engaged in such blatant fraud had forfeited all respect and that Haeckel had eliminated himself from the ranks of scientific research workers of any stature. But they were not inaccuracies. They were intentional distortions of the truth. What is most troubling is that despite the analysis by Wilhelm Hess, Haeckel's embryos and recapitulation theory continued to adorn textbooks for close to 150 years. In 1997, the full extent of Haeckel's fraud was rediscovered. Notice the title on this article, and brought to light when Michael Richardson, an embryologist at St. George Hospital Medical School in London, evaluated the embryos of various vertebrates and published the results in the prestigious journal Science. In an interview for the London Times, Richardson stated this: "This is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud. It is shocking to find that somebody one thought was a great scientist was deliberately misleading. What he did was to take the human embryo and copy it, pretending that the salamander and the pig and all the others looked the same at the same stage of development. They don't. They are fakes." Thus was the illustrious beginning of Darwinism, and how many across the globe became convinced of the lie of evolution through false teachings and outright fraud. Do not be deceived by the false teachers who continue to propagate this lie today. God has made the world full of abundant evidence of its creation, clear and unmistakable, but these natural scientists cannot or refuse to see the truth. Well, another of Haeckel's frauds was committed to prove human evolution, that humans had evolved from apes. Haeckel was the first person to draw an evolutionary tree, an evolutionary family tree that included mankind at the top. But to fill in the gap between apes and humans, he invented an ape man. Now, he argued that the only major difference between man and ape was that men could speak and apes could not. He therefore fabricated a missing link, which he named Pithecanthropus alalis, which means speechless ape man. He had an artist draw the imagined creature, although there was not a scrap of physical evidence to support its existence. A contemporary of Haeckel's, by the name of Rudolf Virchow, who was the founder of cellular pathology and for many years was the president of the Berlin Anthropological Society, was scathing in his criticism of Haeckel. He said, for Haeckel to have given a scientific name to a creature that had not been proven to exist was to him a great mockery of science. But Haeckel wasn't the only evolutionist to fabricate an ape man. In 1911, the discovery of an ape man called Piltdown Man was reported by a fossil hunter named Charles Dawson. He claimed to have found pieces of a human skull while excavating in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England, and later claimed to have found an ape-like lower jaw with human-like teeth after some additional digging. The two fossils were assigned to the same person who was said to be at least 500,000 years old. It was announced with much fanfare that Darwin's missing link had been found. The discovery was published on the front page of the New York Times under the headline, "Darwin's theory is proved true. English scientists say the skull found in Sussex establishes human descent from apes." For decades, Piltdown Man reigned supreme in our classrooms, textbooks, and museums. Scores of pamphlets and articles were published about Piltdown Man. However, more than 40 years later, in 1953, scientists subjected the find to analysis which proved the jawbone was of recent origin. Close inspection revealed marks on the teeth which had been shortened to make them appear human-like. In addition, the bones had been treated with chemicals to increase the appearance of their age. It was concluded that the jawbone was a forgery and was later determined to be from an orangutan. Piltdown Man is now recognized as one of the most spectacular and longest enduring frauds in the history of modern science, and sadly, one that convinced many people that humans had evolved from apes. 40 years, this thing convinced people that humans had evolved from apes. Another was Nebraska Man. Nebraska Man was discovered in western Nebraska in 1922. Media reports flooded classrooms, and it was in fact used in school textbooks for several years. It was even presented as evidence in the Scopes trial, the propaganda trial staged by the American Civil Liberties Union to challenge the Butler Act, which prevented the teaching of human evolution in public schools in Tennessee at the time. Well, what was discovered? Was a complete skeleton? A complete skeleton was not found, nor was a complete skull or even a jawbone. What did they actually find that helped prove this missing link existed? Well, all they found was a single molar tooth, shown here from the original publication. But look at all the detail about a Nebraska man that you can get from a single tooth. Well, you can tell what his entire anatomy looks like and what his wife looks like too, apparently. Well, to make matters worse, after further examination, the tooth was found to be neither an ape nor a man. It turned out to belong to a pig. A retraction was finally published in Scientific American 5 years after its original claim of discovery. The genus of the pig, called a peccary, was identified later and published the same year in the journal Science. Sadly, though, this type of ape-man misidentification has been far from an isolated incident. In 1983, a dolphin rib was also misidentified as a hominid bone. Dr. Tim White, an anthropologist at the University of California, Berkeley, criticizes the claim, calling the fossil Flipperpithecus after the dolphin flipper. He states this: a 5-million-year-old piece of bone that was thought to be the collarbone of a human-like creature is actually part of a dolphin rib. The problem with a lot of anthropologists, he says, is that they want so much to find a hominid that any scrap of bone becomes a hominid bone. Well, in fact, ape men have been attributed to tiny fragments of bones which actually belonged to not only pig and dolphin, but alligators, horse, bear, elephant, and even donkeys. Nigel Hawkes, the science correspondent and health editor for the Times newspaper in London, stated, "Few sciences produce such abundant returns from so few fragments of fact as paleontology." But it wasn't fossils that convinced most people that humans had evolved from apes, but rather illustrations. And this illustration in particular, known as the March of Progress, as it became known, it was published in 1965 in a Time Life book series titled Early Man by Clark Howell from the University of California, Berkeley. It is one of the most famous and recognizable scientific illustrations ever produced, and was the most successful tool used to promote human evolution using the power of visual proof. It depicted 15 human evolutionary ancestors lined up as if marching in a parade, beginning with proto-apes, then apes, and up to modern humans, shown here in the pre-fold-out version. When folded out, a 5-page poster was displayed, shown here. A worldwide mailing of the 5-page fold-out for promotional purposes caused the illustration to receive much greater viewing than did the book. The illustration ended up in countless science classrooms and libraries. Even Stephen Jay Gould, who is arguably one of the most famous evolutionists of our day, well, I say this because he was featured in a cameo on The Simpsons, which, if you're on The Simpsons, animated TV show, as a scientist, I think that's your reason to claim fame right there. But he describes it this way: it is the canonical representation of evolution, the one picture immediately grasped and viscerally understood by all. Well, the truth about the March of Progress is that it was a brilliant propaganda tool that sadly convinced more people that humans evolved from ape than any physical evidence. The main problem, it was knowingly fictitious. Evolutionists knew at the time that proto-apes and apes did not walk upright on 2 feet as depicted. In fact, these fossil apes were dated long before evolutionists believed that bipedalism had evolved. The author, in fact, states this: although proto-apes and apes were quadrupedal, meaning they walked on 4 legs, all are shown here standing for comparison. But note, they're not shown standing, they're shown walking, many of them with 1 foot in front of the other. Thus the name March of Progress. Of course, the disclaimer was on the back of the poster. No one could see that. Well, the truth is, there is an enormous gap between humans and apes that is simply not supported by fossil evidence. All of the ape men were created by distorting data or imposing highly speculative assumptions on reconstructions. They combine ape fossils with human fossils and then declare the two to be one individual, a real ape man, like Piltdown Man was committed this way, with an orangutan and a human skull. Also, Homo habilis is argued to be a combination of ape and human fossils. Another way they can create these ape men is they emphasize human-like qualities of fossilized apes. They've done this with Australopithecines. And with imagination, they upgrade these apes to look more human-like, or they emphasize the ape-like qualities of fossilized humans, like Neanderthals or Homo erectus, and with imagination, downgrade the humans to be more ape-like. Well, after the discovery of Neanderthals, this is how they were originally depicted, as very ape-like in appearance. And like all the claims of the theory of evolution, this view was once taught as a matter of fact, teachings that are now known to be completely false. Well, one of the most common anatomical distortions found when paleoanthropologists are trying to make humans more ape-like is with the position of the jawbone on the skull. If the jawbone is positioned forward, it looks more ape-like. If the jawbone is positioned back, you have a flat face like humans. Well, this diagram was purchased by Jack Cuozzo at the Neanderthal Museum in Berlin, which has the jawbone positioned a full 30 centimeters out of its socket, called the fossa, to make the skull more ape-like, what is called a shovel face. However, when the jaw is correctly placed, the skull is clearly human and in no way resembles an ape. Note the difference between the distorted diagram, purchased at the Neanderthal Museum, and a more current diagram of a typical Neanderthal skull, which are very, very human-like. The original ape-like reconstructions are now known to be nothing but speculative false claims. Note this model from the Neanderthal Museum in Mettmann, Germany, and another from the same museum, or this reconstruction of a Neanderthal child by the Anthropological Institute in the University of Zurich. It was made using modern techniques of computer-assisted paleoanthropology. The Neanderthals were humans. Well, Eric Tinkus is an anthropologist at the Washington University and an expert on Neanderthal biology and human evolution. He says this: a detailed comparison of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans have shown that there is nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. Dr. Sodera, a human anatomist, agrees. He says, despite their stocky body build and their stocky skull shape, there is no hard evidence to say that Neanderthals were in any way inferior intellectually to modern man. They are known to have made sophisticated flint tools, to build huts out of animal skins, and had control of fire. They also buried their dead, a very human-like activity. Well, now it is very clear that the initial reconstructions of Neanderthal were terribly, terribly wrong. Neanderthals were 100% human. They had a brain capacity, in fact, about 200 cubic centimeters larger than average human. They used jewelry, they used musical instruments, they made cave paintings, buried their dead, and we now know that they interbred with recognized Homo sapien populations. They were humans. They were just humans. Well, fossilized apes, like Australopithecines, were also distorted to make them look more human-like. Models of these tiny apes standing upright can be found in museums and universities across the globe. This one is at the Las Vegas Natural History Museum. This one is at the Ancestors exhibit at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. This reproduction is at the Living World exhibit at the St. Louis Zoo. It was constructed, look at it, with very human-like hands and feet, with a human-like posture, a gait, arms and legs. Also note the very, very pensive gaze on its face, a very thoughtful expression, apparently pondering its future or something of the sort. And again, it's not scientific findings that have convinced most people that evolution is true, but rather false teachings and outright distortions of the truth. They make diagrams and models that are either speculative or knowingly distorted to project their views about evolution. Note, for example, this reconstruction published in National Geographic in 1996. It has several human-like qualities that were added, including whites in their eyes, which is a human characteristic. No apes have whites visible in their eyes. The sculptor even admits to this. He stated, "I wanted to get a human soul into this ape-like face to indicate something about where she was headed. So they've changed it to make it look more human-like, to project their views on evolution into this model. Knowingly distorted." Well, unfortunately, such reconstructions that contain known distortions of the truth are all too common in paleoanthropology and have been very effective in convincing people that ape men were real. Take a closer look at those very human-like hands and feet of the Australopithecine at the Living World exhibit, which is a complete lie. Prior to the creation of this exhibit, fossils had been found that showed their hands and feet were very curved and ape-like and looked nothing like this model. In fact, in 1983, Jack Stern and Russell Sussman, a human anatomist at the Stony Brook University School of Medicine in New York, compared the fingers and toes of Australopithecines with other apes and humans and published their work in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology and stated this: "A summary of the morphological and functional affinities of the Hadar hand fossils leads inexorably to an image of a suspensory adapted hand, surprisingly similar to hands found in the small end of the pygmy chimpanzee, common chimpanzee range. They're like pygmy chimpanzee hands, adapted for hanging in trees. In fact, the entire anatomy of Australopithecines is ape-like and nothing like humans. The shoulder socket is sharply angled, as they are in all primates that live in trees, for brachiation, swinging by the arms from branch to branch. Humans are vertically oriented, though their pelvic bones were also similar to chimps. Humans have very different pelvic bones that permit us to walk upright. The iliac blade of humans goes front to back, whereas in apes, they flare out laterally." Stern and Sussman noted this difference as well. They said, "The fact that the anterior portion of the iliac blade faces laterally in humans but not in chimpanzees is obvious. The marked resemblance of Lucy, one of these famous Australopithecines, to the chimpanzee is equally obvious. It suggests to us that the mechanism of lateral pelvic balance during bipedalism was closer to that in apes than in humans." They were apes, tiny apes at that. The skull of the Australopithecines is also extremely ape-like, with a sloping face, typical of apes, what we call the shovel face. Its cranial capacity even smaller than typical apes. Plus, it doesn't have the nasal bones that humans possess. The jaw of Australopithecines is much more similar to chimps than in humans. The canine teeth come in at an angle, unlike humans, which come in straight down. Also, the point of attachment of the spine, which in humans is close to the center, allowing upright postures even further back on the skull than it is in chimps. Well, what makes this such an overwhelming example of false teachings is that these differences have been noted for decades and noted by world-renowned scientists, and yet Australopithecines continue to be put forward as an evolutionary ancestor of humans. Ashley Montague, shown here, is a British-American anthropologist who taught at Harvard, Princeton, Rutgers, the University of California, and New York University. And he denied that Australopithecine was a human ancestor. He said this: "The skull form of all Australopithecines is extremely ape-like. The Australopithecines show too many specialized and ape-like characteristics to either be the direct ancestor of man or in a line that led to man." Lord Zuckerman, who was a professor of anatomy at Birmingham University in England and a chief scientific advisor to the British government, regarded the Australopithecine skull as fully simian. He said this: "But I myself remain totally unpersuaded. Almost always, when I have tried to check the anatomical claims on which the Staphylococcus australopithecus is based, I have ended in failure. The Australopithecine skull is in fact so overwhelmingly simian as opposed to human that the contrary proposition could be equated to an assertion that black is white." They were apes, nothing but pure apes. Australopithecines have many characteristics shared with chimpanzees and almost none shared with humans. a sentiment that was well expressed by Charles Oxnard, who is arguably the world's foremost expert on computerized analysis of bones using digitized X-rays and 3D rendering. He was a former professor of anatomy and anthropology at the University of Chicago and is currently at the University of Western Australia. He said this: "The Australopithecines are now irrevocably removed from a place in the evolution of human bipedalism, possibly from a place in a group any closer to humans than to African apes, and certainly from any place in the direct human lineage." Personally, however, I think Dr. Oxnard's views are a bit naive. See, an evolutionary theory will never be abandoned and its evidence removed until something better is found to take its place. That's why Piltdown Man lasted for so long. Therefore, despite the overwhelming and enormous problems found in Australopithecines since the original discovery, they remain today as the leading transition between apes and humans. The truth is, humans have only evolved from apes in the imaginations of paleoanthropologists. There is virtually no physical evidence to show it has ever taken place. They were apes and only made to look like humans by distorting reconstructions to convince the world that we are nothing but an evolved ape.